So just last week we did a little podcast about Thanksgiving, talked about some different things, and I mentioned a gentleman that was one of my mentors, George, and told you a little bit about old George Cox, that little cabin, and how much I learned from George. There's been another George instrumental in my life, and quite frankly in my career as an appraiser and more importantly an educator. And I just wanted to talk about that George for a minute and say thank you to that George, and we'll talk about it when we come back. Hi, this is Brian Reynolds. You're listening to the Appraisal Update Podcast, brought to you as always by the great folks over at Appraiser eLearning. I'm glad you're here. I hope you're doing well. And last week, as I mentioned, I talked about George Cox and all that I learned from him, and on that little front porch of the cabin out in the middle of nowhere in the woods. Well, I was just down the street from that location in the woods, from that little one-bedroom cabin in the middle of the woods. I was just down there on Saturday hunting, and not in the exact same location where Mr. Cox was, but not far away at all. I hunt and fish there at a buddy's property farm. And Miss Teresa Walker tried to call me, and I thought that was unusual because we just had a conversation, I think 2 days before. She said, Brian, I'm going on vacation. Leave me alone. And she was going on a cruise. So I'm like, why is Teresa Walker calling me while she's on her cruise? I'm in the woods. I'm looking at deer, ready to shoot something. And I got a call, and of course I didn't answer it. I'm in the woods. But I texted her back, and I said, "Sorry, I'm in the woods. What's going on?" And then she texted me back and said, "George Harrison just died," or she was made aware that he had passed, and it hit me. It set me back. And Dr. Harrison was an appraiser. He was an educator. He started the Columbia Institute and was really the catalyst, really started the National Association of Appraisers. He was one of the founding members. There were more than just him, but it was his vision. It was at his direction that organization, in which presently, as of this broadcast, I'm serving as the president of the National Association of Appraisers. And it shocked me, but it didn't. George was 85, and but I want to just talk about some of the things that George did for me, and I know he did so much for so many. I remember Diana Jacob talking about on and on and on how instrumental he was, how he encouraged her, how he gave her an opportunity. And she was one of the first females that was an educator. And George encouraged that. I hear Bobby Crisp talk about Dr. Harrison all the time. And I got one class. And he told that story the other day, and so Bobby and I tease about that all the time. I got one class. Bobby, can you teach this? Brian, can you teach this? George, I can teach anything you want me to. I've got one class. You name it, whatever you want to. And Bobby and I laughed about that a lot. But George is really, both Georges, to be fair, is how I got my start in the education space. George Cox, I started teaching for in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And originally I was there as a prop or a helper, I suppose. And with in short order, I began leading the classes. In fact, George sometimes would leave class and go to the horse track and said, I'll be back. Sometimes he was, sometimes he wasn't, but he left the class in my hands. And I taught for Mr. Cox for several years. And I said, George, I'm thinking about getting my USPEP credential. And he's like, oh, you don't need that. But I got it. And that's when Dr. Harrison and I connected. And George took a chance on me, didn't know me, but took a chance on me and encouraged me along the way. So that's how I got my start teaching outside of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, mostly in Tennessee. And then before I knew it, George was flying me all over the country, teaching courses for the Columbia Institute all over the United States. And it was a very rewarding experience. I learned a lot. And I remember one time I was talking to George. We were at a conference or something. He did instructor training workshops, and those were great. And I remember one time George said, Brian, how many students do you think you reach in a given year? I said, George, I have no idea. Several hundred, maybe 1,000. I don't know. He said, well, think how many you would reach if you wrote an article. I'm like, oh, George, I'm not a writer. Heck, I barely read. I can read. I just choose not to. And I'm trying to do better about that. That's on my to-do list. Just ordered a book the other day and about to order another one. But George said, just think if you wrote something. This publication over here has an audience of 40,000 folks, and this publication over here has a subscription base of 70,000. And so I wrote my first article as a consequence of George Harrison. I was at the Appraisal Summit early on. This was probably in 2009, 2010. And they were going to have a panel. And the panel consisted of an AMC, a banker, a moderator, and they wanted an appraiser. And George came to me and he said, Brian, I want you on this panel. I said, sure, George, yeah. And as I thought about it, I thought, that might not be a good idea. So right before we were going on, it was Tony Pastelli. Hey, Tony. It was Brian Coaster, who I don't think's in our space anymore. Matt McHale. Matt, hello, if you're listening. And George had picked me. And I went up to George. And I said, George, you have a second? And he said, sure. And I said, Doc, are you sure? Are you sure you want me on this panel? And this was just about when the AMCs really started taking off. It was out right toward the end of the HVCC, the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, commonly known as Dodd-Frank. And there was a lot of uncertainty, and these appraisal management companies were popping up. Appraisers hated them. And I said, George, are you sure you want me on this panel? And I remember this like it was yesterday. George, are you sure you want me on this panel? And he said, Brian, why would you ask me that? And I said, George, because when they ask me for my opinion, I'm going to give it to them. And George, without hesitation, looked at me and said, that's exactly why I want you on this panel. George wanted me to be brutally honest. George didn't want me to hold back. George wanted me to speak on behalf of the boots on the ground appraiser, as he most commonly referred to us as. So I was on that panel, and it was a lively debate. I don't know if it's still out there, but you can maybe Google it and find it. It was a very lively debate. Dr. Harrison did so much for so many, and he will be greatly missed and always remembered. I got a couple of little pictures I'm going to show. I know this is a podcast and you might be listening, but this very well may be an encouragement for you to go to our YouTube channel and watch the video that I'm recording as well, because I'm going to show a couple of pictures of Dr. Harrison right now. So this is a picture of some of the Columbia Institute folks. And that's Gene and Rosie and Dr. Harrison. This is a picture that that George said, "Oh, Brian, you dressed up." You know, I had on just a pullover shirt there. This is a picture. Let me get rid of this little thing. I'm sorry, guys. Let me go back. There's the first picture. This was at the Appraisal Summit. It used to be, as you can see up here, called the Appraisal Summit and Expo. And that was the registration desk where you went and picked up your stuff. This was the one I was talking about a moment ago. George gave me a hard time because I just had a pullover on. Bobby's barely better. I mean, he's got a button-up shirt, but certainly not a suit and tie. And I think this is right when I got to Las Vegas. I mean, this is my travel clothes, George. Here's George and Miss Diana. George loved to eat. At least at the conferences, I'd see him snacking all the time. There he is with Lori, I'm sure, talking appraisal shop. Here's a picture with the board of directors. This is when I first became a member of the board, and George was still very active in attending the events. This is George and Miss Diana. I got some duplicates there. I'm sorry. This is George at some sort of meeting. You see Miss Teresa over there working diligently, keeping him on track. George used to give us all our certificates when we presented. And then finally, I think this sums up George a bunch, right? Looking over his right shoulder and somebody capturing a photo and that little smile he would always give us. So anyway, just wanted to get on here and say thank you to another George, Mr. George Harrison, the individual that created the Columbia Institute, which I believe celebrated 25 years at his retirement, the individual that created the Appraisal Summit and Expo, which was later just dropped down to the Appraisal Summit, and the individual, in my opinion, directly responsible for creating the National Association of Appraisers with obviously help from some other founding members. Hats off to you, George. Rest in peace, my friend. Your work here is done. You've touched many, many lives, many, many appraisers, and you will not be forgotten. If you've listened to my podcast very much at all, at the end, I'll normally say something like, make lots of money, stay busy, take a little vacation, a mini vacation. But I typically end my podcast by saying happy appraising. And that comes from Dr. George Harrison. Thank you, George, for everything. Happy appraising.
The Appraisal Update podcast is brought to you by Appraiser eLearning.